Dr. Paulette Kurzer is a professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Arizona. Dr. Kurzer's research interests include institutions of the European Union and the intersection between domestic and European policy making. Her work has appeared in the Journal for European Public Policy and the Journal of Common Market Studies and other referred journals, as well as several edition volumes. Her most recent is Markets and More Regulation, and she is the author of What's for Dinner? European Farming and Food Traditions Confront American Biotechnology. She is currently working on the perception of risk and the formation of new public health domain in the EU. And with that, I will bring her up. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. It's great being here. I think my first time in the state of Indiana, and thus far it has been great. Even the weather has been great. It's nice to have some rain. It's just 60 degrees. Sick of the heat. My talk follows very nicely actually a nice combination of our previous talks. My talk, I was not sure what the audience was. I thought the audience was a mixture of like academics and practitioners. So it's very light on the theory and heavier on just the facts. But I have there a question mark, future of green biotechnology in Europe, and instead of keeping you in suspense, and I'll give it away right now. The answer is that the future does not look very positive in Europe. There are still quite a few barriers in place that I don't see exactly how they're going to be transcended. I just want to make one tiny side comment based on a comment I just heard now. When we talk about biotechnology, let's say biotech, green biotechnology, we're talking about three different categories. We're talking about biotech seeds to be used for planting and cultivation. We're talking about food ingredients, and we're talking about animal feed. And it's true that animal feed, which basically consists of soybeans, and soybeans are not grown in Europe, all of it is imported. Just about all of it, like 99% is imported. And at this point of time, nearly all soybeans planted for animal feeds are the GM variety. And therefore, although the European Union has not approved GM soybeans, they know, just as well as we know, that these GM soybeans are entering the EU market, and they have to rectify this because this is a crazy situation. Yes, sure. The green biotechnology has a very long history. When it first arrived, there was an enormous uproar because at that time the European Union did not have harmonized, coordinated rules to approve for the importation or the release of GM seeds or food ingredients in the EU market. They imposed an informal moratorium until they were able to bargain and compromise on those rules. And indeed, in 2003, the European Union adopted two regulations that governed the system to trace and label GMOs and to regulate the commercialization labeling of food derivatives that contain GMO. However, I can tell you 100% sure there is not a single food product in the market in the European Union right now that contains a GMO ingredient. And this is the famous, GM tomato that Friends of the Earth likes to show off to explain to the consumer what may happen if you actually digest this material. Now, why is this? There's two reasons. We do have a very fine and very elaborate regulatory framework. That framework consists out of different stages. The first stage is that there is a whole new agency that was set up specifically in order to do scientific research on the safety of these biotech products. That is the European Food and Safety Authority. That agency issues a report. That report goes to the Commission. The Commission vets the report, the Commission votes. Then the Commission issues a recommendation. The report and the recommendation then go to the Council, to the Member States. This is actually a technocratic committee that consists out of national representatives of the Member States. And there they vote. And then for the report and the recommendation of the Commission to be approved, you need a qualified majority vote. You need 72% of the votes. Thus far, not a single request, in spite of the green light of EFSA and of course the positive recommendation of the Commission, has been voted in. So therefore, since the lifting of the moratorium, nothing has been approved. this is not so much because a lot of member states are opposed. When you break down the votes, what is really remarkable, a lot of member states do not vote and actually abstain. They basically have no opinion, or there may be internal strife within the coalition with the government themselves. So the first reason that you don't have new food products on the market since 2004 is that none have been approved, although several have been submitted. But there is a second reason. The second reason is that one part of the regulations that were approved in 2003 calls for positive labeling. A positive labeling means that a food product, let's say a can of corn, if it contains GMO, it has to say in a little label, contains GMO. So subsequently, of course, most retailers have decided that since the consumers are opposed to it, they don't want to stock any of those GMO products. And here you see, this is from the Eurobarometer of 2005. Here you see, familiarity with GM foods. Remarkably high in the European Union of 25. It's 2005, it's before Romania and Bulgaria. 80% has familiarity with GM foods. The lowest one is Malta, Lithuania, with only 50%. But here we are, go back, oops. Here we have, do you support? Well, that is remarkably low, as you can see. It is as if the more you know, the less you like it. It is because of this consumer resistance, which is partly fed by and driven by extremely successful NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that have used GMO also to enhance and to strengthen their own organizations. They've used this as an agenda, as an activity to cultivate memberships, to build up resources, and they have kept this in the news. But in these circumstances, many food retailers, many of the large international food retailers have decided that it does not make sense to stock corn or soup or biscuits or cookies or cornflakes that must have that label because the consumer is not going to buy it. So there's two reasons then why we don't find GMO products in the European market. One, since 2004, none have been approved, but the ones that were approved before 2004, they're grandfathered in, but they don't appear because the private sector has decided that they don't want to sell those products. Now, I don't think I have time for this, but this actually has had also consequences for the United States. Many American food processors have made conscious choices not to use GMO ingredients because they prefer international standardization where the same product can be sold in every market than to have separate factories, separate products, and maybe even separate labeling, because in one market, yes, there is no problem. In the other market, you need a special label, and because of that, they don't want it. So you see here, familiarity breeds contempt. NGOs, social movements have agitated against GMO. The private sector has decided not to put any products with GMO on the market because products must carry a positive label. And subsequently, therefore, this particular part of the green biotechnology is dead. But we have more stuff. We have GM seeds. That's different. That's totally different, yeah? And it has been much harder for a consumer movement to mobilize against GM seeds. Now, what has happened with the GM seeds story? Here too, the EU has passed quite a few regulations. The regulation allows the importation of those seeds or allows the development of those seeds. When it comes to liability clauses, because seeds of course carried by the birds or the insects or the winds from one area to another area. When it comes to liability, that is delegated to the member states, but the seeds themselves have received approval. Okay. The EU regulations only examine risk assessment of the planting of the biotech seeds and therefore not risk management, which is decentralized, that is to the member states. Now, what has happened is, again, there is some controversy about whether they want to develop or import those seeds. We're talking about the European Union, but the European Union is really divided into three groups. There's one group of member states that basically has no opinion. Yeah, because for them this is not on the agenda, they're not going to plant the seeds. They don't have a biotech pharmaceutical sector that wants to develop these, so they don't have much of an opinion. And then we have a small coalition of member states that are very much in favor. We have here, some unlikely candidates. The Netherlands is, for example, very much in favor because they have a very strong agri-pharmaceutical sector and they want to be able to develop their own varieties and then have a market where they can sell it. France is a big supporter, although the French consumers are very much opposed to it. But the French state is in splendid isolation and they just kind of do whatever they want to do. But there's a little disjunction here between the opinion of French government officials and the voters. And then we have a group of countries that are dead set opposed to it. And dead set opposed to it is Austria, is Greece, and is Italy. And it's interesting that we have some kind of background information why they're opposed to it, because these are exactly the kind of countries that would fit very nicely in the argument about the importance of space and the cultural symbolism of a geographic area. Austria, Greece, and Italy are opposed to GM seeds because they feel that it attacks and it threatens the essence of what it means to be Italian or Austrian or Greek. Don't even ask me why that might be, because there is not a direct logical connection here. But if you look, for example, in Italy, where the slow food movement is huge, they believe that GMO plants may contaminate, may undermine what is the purity of the slow food movement, and therefore the slow food movement will not be able to sustain itself, and therefore what is intrinsic to Italian agriculture will slowly but surely disappear, become industrialized, manufactured, homogenized, and then what is the comparative advantage in international markets of Italian food will disappear. They have the same in Austria. I know, we're not very well familiar with Austrian food, but Austria has a huge agricultural organic sector. That organic sector is very afraid that if they introduce GM seeds into Austrian farming, that will contaminate and spill over into organic farming, and then organic farming can no longer be considered organic farming, and then both the commercial and the economic viability of this particular area is finished. So this is where we are. Yeah, go on, yeah. There is one seed, a maize variety from Monsanto, that was actually approved in 1998. And the approval was for 10 years. And then after 10 years, there's a renewal of the approval process. EFSA, which is the European Food and Safety Authority, issued a report saying that after 10 years and further studies, this particular seed is absolutely safe and should be reintroduced and revalidated for a further 10 years in the European market. However, countries like Austria, Greece, and Italy have banned biotech seeds and crops. They have banned them. They have declared a national ban on them. And they have refused to lift the ban in spite of the many reports that say that these GM seeds are safe for consumption, safe for animal feeds. Go on. This is a nice map of the areas in Europe that have declared themselves GMO free. This map includes some countries, like you see a big country, Poland there. All of Poland has declared itself GMO free. This is Poland has a very large agricultural sector, knowing that European consumers are not very sympathetic to GMO food products. They have decided we're going to play it safe and just make sure that we don't cultivate and grow any GMO seeds, so that we won't have problems later on bringing it to the market. And then you see some other countries that are totally in green. And then what is interesting, there are some regions and kind of town and cities that have declared themselves GMO green. Yeah. Now, what is the issue here? Okay, the issue here, and this is an issue that has been brought to the World Trade Organization. It has a pretty long route, basically since 2005. The issue is we have a single market, and in the single market, everybody has to be on the same page. So we cannot have a single market where in some countries a product is banned and in other countries it is not banned. In the meantime, it's basically legal in the EU. You cannot have that. Yeah. That is That is exactly what the single market is not about, and that is why you have a Brussels and you have a European Commission, and that's why you have these committees, and that is why you have EFSA. The whole system is set up in order to avoid a situation of fragmentation of regulatory standards that impedes the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. The Commission has asked the member states to tell Austria to lift its ban. And the member states have refused to do that. Now the Commission can force Austria to lift its ban. It can bring Austria to the European Court of Justice and, hopefully, garner enough peer group pressure if it wants that the Austrian government will switch and lift the ban. But the Commission feels stronger and more confident if it has on its side other member states. It has asked 3 times for a formal vote of reprimand against Austria, telling it that what it's doing is against the law of the EU. And the member states have refused to do this. And the member states have refused to do that because they figure sometime down the line they may be an outlier in a similar kind of scenario where they feel very strongly about an issue. And when they feel very strongly about an issue, they want to make sure the other member states are on their side. So they have refused to do that. So therefore, in July 2009, they came together and decided, it's just like the soybean situation. We have to think maybe outside the box and break through the stalemate and deadlock, which is causing a lot of friction with the United States and with Brazil and with Argentina and with the World Trade Organization. And so what they have decided is that perhaps instead of having European-wide uniform risks assessment, renationalize the risk assessment, and it fits very nicely what was said earlier about renationalizing parts of agriculture. Yeah. When there is these deadlocks and stalemate in a group with 27 member states, at this point it's so hard to forge those compromises and move forward, then perhaps the second best option, which is not a great option, is to actually take a step back and to renationalize risk assessment together with then the risk management. But I want to explain to you that this is going to be very dangerous for the future of green biotechnology. Very dangerous. I actually think that this is going to put an end to green biotechnology in Europe for the time being. Because the problem is going to be, how do you deal with the liabilities? How do you prevent the genetic cross-pollination? How do you prevent the contamination? What is Austria going to do if Slovenia is cultivating GMO seeds? I mean, are you going to create like a huge screen there, or are you going to ban birds from flying over? Are you going to have huge turbines and make sure the wind is going into the other direction? So the truth of the matter is, the way that I, would think this is going to play out is that ultimately it will be very hard for those regions or countries that do want to play around with GM seed varieties to actually plant them. There are countries that are very excited because they have their own agropharmaceutical industry, which has been stunted because there's no ready market in Europe, and they may not be able to sell it readily in the United States, which is already, of course, in the pockets of Monsanto. But there is no, of course, European system in place in order to deal about the liabilities of possible contamination. And it could very well be that, number 3, the end of uniform rules and separate risk assessment may lead the way to permanently thwart the adoption of biotech seeds. So, as I've told you, no biotech food products on the markets. Yeah, I've told you there's going to be animal feed that contain, GM ingredients, but that is animal feed. So there, the market is going to be kind of structured. But when the third category, which is GM seeds, I figure that market is going to be closed as well if they're going back to the renationalization of risks assessment. Well, thank you.